Good afternoon and welcome to our May webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training and Support Center. My name is Janie Greco and I am the Training and Support Specialist at RTSC. Our technical producers today are Renee Williams and John Sullivan. Today's webinar is Residential Education, Working with Students Who Have Experienced Complex Developmental Trauma, presented by Maureen McGettigan. Maureen is the Clinical Director at the Home for Little Wanderers, Southeast Campus in Plymouth, Massachusetts. She has 26 years of experience specializing in the treatment of psychological trauma, including 2.5 years at the Trauma Center in Brookline with Bessel Kolk, where she was Interim Director of the Child Treatment Team. During the webinar, please type your questions in the toolbox and feel free to engage with other attendees. We will leave time at the end of the hour to address the questions. If your question is not answered live, please send us an email and we will do our best to follow up with you. If you are interested in learning more about the Federation, please go to our website at www.fcsn.org and explore all the different programs, including how to volunteer to become a special education surrogate parent or attend one of our many trainings presented by the Parent Training Information Center. Good afternoon, Maureen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Janie. And thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm Maureen McGettigan. I'm the Clinical Director at the Home for Little Wanderers, Southeast Campus in Plymouth, and I've been there for just over 7 years. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty right now.
Okay.
So I had been working in the field of trauma, excellent, thank you, for about 18 years before I went to residential, and it was a quick learning curve for me, and I was fortunate to, and have been fortunate to work with wonderful staff in the school, in the milieu, and on my clinical team. And so I just wanted to say that this is work, it's hard work to do, and we don't do it alone, we do it as members of a team, and so I wanted to acknowledge all of the people that I have worked with over the years who've taught me so much. So I understand from Janie that you all have had a fair amount of training in trauma, and so I did want to go over just briefly a little bit of a brush up for you. So the traumatic stress field has adopted the term complex trauma to describe the experience of multiple chronic and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events, most often of an interpersonal nature, such as sexual or physical abuse or community violence, and early life onset. So the children that we see in residential programs tend to be kids that have had this very severe developmental trauma starting at a very early age. It's not outside the experience, the normal experience for kids in residential to have been exposed to substances in utero, and then to have been born into families where there is domestic violence and there is chronic drug use and there's neglect, and there's physical abuse and oftentimes sexual abuse as well. So their early life experiences are of pretty chronic and overwhelming trauma. So when this happens, there's multiple areas of children's development that are impacted by this exposure to trauma. So the big areas would be attachment, biology or physiology, affect regulation, which is sort of the emotions, dissociation, behavioral control, cognition, and self-concept. So in terms of attachment, children learn about the world through their relationship with their primary caregivers. So when there are problems with the primary caregivers, when they're not able to care for the children and to provide a safe and nurturing environment for them, the children then have a multitude of difficulties in terms of their relationships with other people going forward. So they have problems with boundaries. They don't know how to keep their bodies separate from other people. They are in preschool. You can see them sort of banging into other kids and not kind of knowing where they are in space. When they're latency age kids, what we tend to notice is that they can't keep their hands to themselves. Sometimes they're going up to other people and hugging them, complete strangers. They don't sort of know what the appropriate social boundaries are. Sometimes we see distrust and suspiciousness. They don't feel comfortable with strangers. You know, so you have sort of the one extreme or the other. You see kids that that go up to complete strangers and are overly familiar with them, and then you see people that it takes a long time for them to feel comfortable and feel safe with them. Social isolation, these are kids that sometimes they have learned that people bring them pain and fear, and so they tend to stay away from other people, and you find them sort of, they're not engaging, they're sort of on the sides in the playground. They don't interact well in groups. They sort of sit back and they kind of watch the world. Interpersonal difficulties, their social skills are poor. They don't know how to get along with other kids. They don't know how to make friends or how to be friends. They don't know how to interact with other people. Difficulty attuning to other people's emotional states, which means that they can have difficulty trying to figure out if somebody else is upset, if somebody else needs some quiet or some comfort. Nobody sort of paid attention to them and what their needs are, and so they didn't learn how to do that for other people. And difficulty with perspective taking. They're not able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes. So if the teacher is helping somebody else and just wants a minute to finish up with that child, they're not able to sort of delay their impulsiveness and like their demand for the teacher's attention at that time. They're not able to put themselves in the other child's shoes or in the teacher's shoes. Biology, this is their physiology, so it's important when there's been physical and sexual abuse, when there's been neglect, that the kid's basic biology has not been attended to. And so they have sensory motor developmental problems. These are kids that sort of weren't necessarily crawling around. They weren't picked up a lot, so they were left to kind of lie there in their cribs or sit in a car seat. So a lot of times they have difficulty with strength in their core of their body. Analgesia, for some of these kids, they've been so physically abused that their body sort of numbs out and they don't have a pain, a sense of pain. I worked with a youngster who even as an adolescent, when he would get, you know, he would play a lot of sports, and so when he would get tackled in football, when he would get an elbow to the face in basketball, it didn't faze him at all. His body had just sort of shut off the ability to notice pain. So there's problems with coordination and balance and body tone. Again, these are kids, you know, if you think about kids being picked up and held and kind of swung around and all of these things, they didn't have that experience, and so their bodies don't know kind of how to make their way in the world. Somatization, that is feeling your emotions physically. So these are kids that have chronic headaches, chronic stomach aches, they have aches in their bodies. I worked with a young boy, and he was 11 years old, and he drew a picture of himself, and it was interesting because he drew a picture of himself with a sword going through sort of his upper shoulder and coming out his waist. And when we talked about it, he'd been physically abused by his father, and he'd been whipped on the back, and so he had a lot of pains in his back, and that was sort of his way of remembering what had happened to him. So he wasn't always remembering the conscious memory of what his father did, but his body was remembering what happened. And again, so there's There's medical problems against a wide span of areas and issues. So when kids' bodies are on alert all the time when they're growing up, their immune system doesn't develop well, their other systems don't develop well, and so these kids go on. I know that you've had a training already on the ACE scale, the Adverse Childhood Experiences scale, where it measures different adverse experiences that children have had and what happens with them as they grow into adulthood, and all of the physical issues that they are party to, diabetes and heart disease and lung issues, as well as the emotional issues. So I know that you've already had a training on that, and I'm not going to go over that, but this is what we mean when we say that biology is impacted. So affect regulation, this is our emotions. Difficulty with emotional regulation. So these are kids that are, there's irritability, kind of chronic irritability all the time, and outbursts of temper tantrums, and that can be as young as 2 years old, and that can be, we've got kids in our residential program that are 16 years old that are still having temper tantrums. Difficulty labeling and expressing feelings. They don't know what they're feeling. A lot of times with boys we hear that they are angry and they're not able to identify anything beyond that. And sometimes we have kids that are just so numb and they don't, they're cut off from their feelings, and so they have sort of a restricted range of what it is that they do feel. They have difficulty knowing and describing their internal states. So we know that sometimes we get physical cues to what's going on. If we're having anxiety, we can have sort of our heart beats a little bit faster, maybe our stomach is a little bit upset. These are kids that don't understand that when that's happening. I was talking with one of my youngsters and asking him if he noticed when he started to get angry, if his breathing changed, and he wasn't able to even, we had to spend time like explaining to him, teaching him how to understand how to measure his breathing and how to measure his heart rate. These guys are really disconnected from their bodies, and they're not able to pick up on those physical cues that maybe something's going on emotionally. And they have a hard time communicating their wishes and their needs. They want people to just understand what it is that they want and what they need without them having to say anything. So dissociation. I'm imagining that you've probably discussed this before, but so dissociation is sort of when our thoughts and our current state are not in sync. And so dissociation kind of runs on a continuum, anything from sort of like a daydream. For those of you like who are driving down the highway and you're thinking about something, either your work day or what's going to go on when you get home, and you've passed a few exits but you haven't been consciously paying attention. So that's a mild form of dissociation, all the way into sort of very altered states of consciousness. And I think, honestly, the best description of dissociation that I ever got was from a 7-year-old girl that I worked with very early in my time. She was not considered a problem in school, but she was not considered a behavioral problem, but she was a bright girl who was not working up to her potential. And when I spoke with her about it, she talked to me and she said, I'm sitting in class and my body is sitting in my chair and my mind leaves my head and it goes under the rug, and my body is sitting at my desk with no mind in my head. And so I think that's a very apt description of what happens with dissociation, because she wasn't able to pay attention to what was actually being taught to her in the classroom. So, there's forgetfulness for parts of what have happened to them. There's difficulty kind of sequencing the events, like first this happened, then that happened. Depersonalization and derealization is sort of the sense that you're not connected to your own self, that like you're watching yourself participate as if you were watching on a movie screen. So there's not a connection to your own self. And then there's impaired memory for state-based events. And so when we think about that, we're thinking about, you know, they can't string together sort of the full senses of what happened along with the memory. So behavioral control, and these are the guys that honestly we end up seeing, the guys and the gals that we end up seeing in residential, because most of these other issues can be addressed through IEPs in the classroom or in collaborative settings. So in terms of the behavioral control, poor modulation of impulses. They can't delay an impulse to save their life. They get like an impulse and they have to act on it immediately. Self-destructive behavior. Sometimes it could be head banging, sometimes it could be cutting, sometimes it could be substance abuse, so any kind of self-destructive behavior. Aggression towards others, these are the kids that usually end up in alternative school settings because because of their poor impulse control. They have no, they get angry with someone and they assault a teacher or they assault a peer, and there's no ability to stop that. Pathological self-soothing behaviors, so this can be sort of the rocking, sometimes it is the head banging, sometimes it's compulsive masturbation. It can be a variety of different behaviors that try to calm them and soothe their level of anxiety. So sleep disturbances, these youngsters have a hard time falling asleep, they have a hard time staying asleep, and they often wake up early in the morning. Eating disorders, we notice in particular in our residential program when kids have had food withheld as a punishment, they go into crisis around food and needing to know that food is available to them. Needing, if dinner is late, they go into crisis because they absolutely need to know that food is available to them. Substance abuse. We've got, you know, sometimes these are the kids that don't quite make it into residential, but they'll be in other schools. Excessive compliance. Whatever somebody asks of them, they will do because they just want to keep someone happy so that they're not abused in some way. Oppositional behavior. So, you know, for some kids, they're just used to arguing and fighting with other people. That's what was role modeled to them, and that's what they take forward with them into the rest of the world. Difficulty understanding and complying with rules. We have a youngster we're working with right now that really just doesn't understand that the rules need to apply to him and wants all kinds of extra activities and extra privileges that he's not willing to do to follow the most basic rules around. And then we see reenactment of trauma and behavior or play. And so for us in particular in our program, we have had a rule that there's no horseplay because for some of these kids what's normal sort of horseplay that you see, you know, regular kids engaging in, for them it triggers bad memories of being hurt in the past, and so what starts off as horseplay turns into full-out assaults. Cognition. These guys have difficulty paying attention. They have difficulty paying attention because they're scanning the environment at all times for danger. They have an exaggerated startle response, so that these are the kids that if I'm talking with them in my office and somebody walks down the hallway, they are acutely sensitive to that. They want to know who's outside because they are expecting that something bad is going to happen all the time. You know, they don't have a lot of curiosity about the world because they're so busy living in survival mode. They have trouble completing tasks. They don't know how to sequence, like first you do this, then you do that. They see a task, it's big, it's overwhelming, and they don't know how to break it down into component parts, and so they just refuse to even start. problems with object constancy. That means sort of the sense that that the rules in this classroom are the same today as they're going to be tomorrow, and that this teacher sort of holds the line on that what she says is what needs to happen, or the way that he sets up his woodshop is, and the way that he orders his tools is the same way that the tools need to be ordered the next day. They have trouble planning and anticipating. They have trouble, you know, figuring out that that transitioning to lunch, coming back from lunch, can be a difficult time. They have trouble taking responsibility for their behavior. They have problems because they think that it's somebody else's problem, you know, why they have acted up. They don't have a sense of time and space because they don't lay down memories the same way that other people lay down memories because of the trauma that they've been through. So they don't have a continuous and predictable sense of self. They don't have a sense of themselves as separate from other people. They have poor self-esteem. They have a lot of shame and guilt. They blame themselves for the fact that they're not living at home. They take on a lot of excessive responsibility that really isn't theirs. They think poorly about themselves. They think that they're bad kids. They are sure that all of the bad things that have happened to them are because of what they've done. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an overview of trauma. So in terms of the components of residential congregate treatment, they are education. In our particular program, there's a school on site. There are clinical services, so we have a full clinical team. There's milieu treatment. Those are the direct care staff, and there are ancillary services. So to sort of break that down, in terms of the school, we have kids that in our particular program, and I would say a fair amount of residential programs where kids live at the program and go to school at the program. Also some kids that live at the program and go to school at collaboratives or at public school, and other kids that come in as day students. So they live in the community and they come in to the school. Some residential programs are all-inclusive, meaning that the kids don't go off campus to school and no kids from off campus come to school there. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both. In terms of the clinical services, so our clinical team provides group therapy in the school setting, and we provide group therapy in the milieu setting. So for the kids that have gone to school off campus during the day, they come back and they have groups. The girls have right now are going through a yoga group for trauma survivors. We have 2 certified yoga teachers that are on our clinical team, and so that's been a helpful thing. They have individual therapy, and for many of our kids 1 hour a week is just not enough for them, and so they are often having daily check-ins with their clinicians. There's family therapy for kids that do have involved family or have foster families that they're going to be returning to. We do family therapy as well. There's a lot of attendance at treatment conferences and IEP meetings, and a lot of teaching of and consultation with the school staff and the milieu staff. In terms of the milieu treatment, the kids in our particular program live in different cabins, and so each cabin has milieu staff assigned to it, so the kids will be working with those milieu staff on a 1-to-3 staffing ratio, doing different activities, going to dinner, working on homework, a variety of different things. And then there are ancillary services. So we have a psychiatrist that comes, and most residential programs will have psychiatry that comes in a couple of times a week. All the residential programs have a nurse that is on site there. We have a cook that does cooking. We've got facilities and maintenance folks, And so there are other services that are available. And then some places have medical care that comes in or dental care that comes in. We have a hygienist that comes in, but all other services we send kids out to, and I think that's fairly common. So one of the treatment philosophies, treatment models that's used at the Home for Little Wanderers in all of the residential programs is something called TCI, Therapeutic Crisis Intervention. This is a model that was developed at Cornell University, and it was developed in the 70s, and it has been researched and modified every year. They continue to change the model in response to what's working and what's not working based on their research. So therapeutic crisis intervention is a 40-hour training initially, and all staff in the Home for Little Wanderers residential programs go through this, and that means the clinicians go through it, the milieu staff, the teachers, the secretary, the cook, the nurse, the maintenance guys, everybody that works in the residential program goes through therapeutic crisis intervention. So the goals are to prevent crises from occurring in the first place, to de-escalate potential crises, to manage the crises effectively, to reduce injuries to kids and staff, to learn, to teach the kids constructive ways to handle stressful situations, and to develop a learning circle within an organization. So for instance, every time, and I think that this is true in most residential programs, every time that there's been a restraint or a major incident, the people get together and meet afterwards, usually the next day, and kind of debrief and process the incident and talk about what could have gone better, what we could maybe do next time, do we need to make any adjustments to the treatment plans. And so, you know, I think that's a way to sort of keep people not being stagnant with the kids. In terms of TCI, not only do you have the initial 40-hour training, but you also have, every year you have to have 16 hours of updated material, so in order to stay current in TCI. So, in terms of TCI, what we're looking for is how can the environment respond to the child that's in crisis in a therapeutic way that works for their developmental level. So the way that we talk about it is that all behaviors have meaning. So what is a child trying to communicate with this particular type of behavior? We ask staff to monitor their own levels of hyperarousal. You know, it can be tough if the cabin is hopping and you've got a bunch of kids that are all struggling at a particular time. Then, you know, then the staff can be a little bit more on edge. And so TCI sort of teaches them to kind of keep an eye on themselves and to switch out with other staff. So it's, we use non-coercive, non-aggressive strategies to work with the kids. We try and do this prior to going towards to a restraint. So restraints are only used as a very last attempt to prevent somebody from harming themselves or harming someone else. It's only a safety intervention that's used at the most acute and extreme situations. So in terms of the TCI model of crisis, there's the baseline or pre-crisis state. That's sort of how the child is on an everyday basis. Then they start to get agitated. It's the triggering phase. So something's triggering them. The escalation phase, when they start to get more aggressive. The outburst phase, when they are potentially becoming violent. And then the recovery phase after the crisis is past. So we do things, manage the environment, we give prompting statements to the kids, directive statements, hurdle help, which is like, I'll do it with you, redirection, you know, caring statements, proximity. Like sometimes kids will borrow from our nervous systems, and so to be close with them when they're having a hard time, to just be in close physical proximity to them can make a difference. You know, some planned ignoring of some behaviors and redirection away. You know, managing the environment it's an interesting one. We had a couple years ago we had some landscaping done, and they brought in a bunch of rocks for drainage for us. That turned out to be not such a great thing because we had kids that picked up rocks and hucked them around, and so we went through some broken windows, and we ended up having to have people come in and take the rocks back out. So I think, you know, that's just one of the things that, like, instead of telling the kids to, you know, or, you know, getting on the kids about it, we just needed to change the environment. So after somebody's been in crisis, they do a life stays interview, which is they isolate the conversation, they pull the child sort of away from, they don't talk to them in front of the other clients. They ask for the youngster to talk about, like, what happened, what's your point of view on what happened. Then they sort of repeat that back, and then they work on connecting the feelings to the behavior. If you remember back, we talked about how kids have difficulty identifying what their feelings are and making connections between their feelings and their behavior. So this is what the staff is doing, working with them all the time. So alternative behaviors are discussed, they get to sort of practice some new behaviors, and then they go back into the group. So this is something that is done at all levels of the organization, but most especially with the milieu staff and the educational staff. So in terms of a typical day in residential, the kids wake up in the morning, they are with the third shift staff. The overnight staff will wake them up and get them ready, feed them breakfast and get them on the bus, get them the medication for the kids that take the bus to school. For the kids that go to school on campus, it's getting them moving out of cabin, making sure they're not taking anything they're not supposed to take to school, getting them off to breakfast. For us, it's in a dining hall, and then off to school. In school, staff are working with the teaching staff, so we're on a 1-to-6 ratio. I think that that's pretty standard for residential programs. And so this gives the teacher the opportunity to be teaching, and then if the child needs to go to the occupational therapy room, or if the child needs to take a walk or a break from the classroom, there's another staff that can step out with them and process something. In the afternoon, they return from school to, in our program, it's a cabin. So we've got kids coming in on buses dropping kids off, and then we've got kids returning from the school into cabin. So the staff is, this is the second shift staff at this time. The first shift staff is working in the school with them during the day. So second shift staff comes on, and they are checking backpacks for homework, and they are talking about activities and getting kids to do their chores, transitioning them to dinner, and then transitioning to activities in the evening. And this could be, sometimes it's going off campus to the Y, sometimes it's working on a paper down in the computer lab, and then there are bedtimes. Getting them ready for bed, and I will say that for most of the kids in residential, bedtime is a very difficult time, so that the staff are wonderful about setting up routines for the kids, ways to make it feel more comfortable for them. We've got some kids that can't fall asleep unless they have a staff sitting in their doorway. So in terms of what does it look like, so this is our science teacher, and this is a science classroom. She's teaching some biology. This is the whiteboard. We also have smart boards in the classroom. Again, I think this is fairly standard for most residential programs. So she's got a lot of things that she's working on to get kids ready for the biology MCAS. So there are a lot of, we do, in our particular program, we do the academics in the morning, and then we have lunchtime, and we do electives in the afternoon. So one of the electives is Woodshop, and the kids in Woodshop learn how to use the tools. They have to follow safety routines, and this is actually a great thing for the kids. They enjoy working with this particular teacher who is a trained carpenter, and had experience doing that before he came to teaching. And he is very strict about safety rules, and so if they break the rules, they are out of Woodshop for a set period of time, and they come back in and they understand that, like, okay, like, safety is #1 important in Woodshop. So they've done things, they've built small things like jewelry boxes, they've built larger things like tables, they've built Adirondack chairs, they do a number of different things. This was one of their projects that they put together. This is sort of an entryway down to a peace pond that they created. This is the pond itself. It's actually, they set it up, there's a pump that pumps water down there. And this is a place that you can't see it, but there's some benches that the kids can sit on, and this is when they feel like they need to calm down, they can take space at the peace pond. And one of the other great things about it is that it can be used for teaching science. We've got frogs that lay eggs there, and then the kids watch the eggs being laid, and then the tadpoles starting to develop, and then more frogs, and so they sort of see that, like, that cycle. We have a culinary program, and again, I think that most residential programs will do this. They've got different kinds of electives. So in our culinary program, the kids do a curriculum that actually staff have to do. It's a serve-safe curriculum, and so they're able to then leave and get jobs in kitchens. One of my old clients did culinary arts and was able to get a job in a kitchen as a prep cook. We have an equine science program. The kids work on a farm. They muck stalls, they groom horses, they give them baths. They also have curriculum where they have to learn about different types of horses, what horses eat, the biology of horses. They get some therapeutic horseback riding in for the work that they have done. And again, when you think back to when we talked about, like, the biology piece of things and having, like, sort of not having a strong core, the kids are working on developing, you know, a stronger body posture through horseback riding. So I talked a little bit about first, second, and third shift already. On vacations and weekends, it's a little bit, it's not as structured, but there's different activities that the kids are going on. So the kids are going off campus. We try and get them out in the community as much as possible. So they could be playing pickup basketball out in one of the neighborhoods. They could be, they go to laser tag, they go to the beach in the summer. You know, so they continue to do, we try and get them off campus, again, as much as possible, whether it's like walking the beach, going down to the waterfront in Plymouth, going up to Boston and walking through Chinatown. That's kind of a favorite thing. Some of the kids like going to Provincetown. So we try and keep them busy, getting them off campus as much as possible. We've got sledding in the winter. In terms of summer school, the way that it goes is the electives sort of drop off a bit in the summer, and it becomes much more physical activities. We have some gardening that takes place where the kids actually grow the food and get to eat it during the summer. We have a fishing dock. We're on a pond, and so we have a fishing dock where it's a catch and release, and the kids are actually, so in the afternoon, that could be one of the activities from school, is a fishing activity. And they could be learning in science about different types of fish, freshwater and ocean fish. We also do fishing trips in the summer, deep water fishing trips that they like. We have a swimming dock, so we teach swimming lessons, and the kids get to go swimming in the summer. On all shifts. That includes the school, like the kids that come into our school that live in the community come with like their towel, their bathing suit, and they're ready to go swimming in the afternoon after they finish their academics in the morning. So the treatment goals and the behavior support plans and the multidisciplinary team, so we all try and work together. We have multidisciplinary team where the milieu staff, the school staff, and the clinicians sit down together. In terms of the behavior support plans, that TCI, the crisis model, we talk about in that we have it specific on what the child looks like at each phase of what they look like at the triggering phase, what they look like at escalation, what kind of behavior support techniques work well with them, which ones don't work, which ones to avoid. And all of us work together and discuss the child and try and come up with individual behavior plans for them. So, challenges in congregate care setting. I think I'm not too bad for time, I guess. So the challenges in congregate care setting. So there's additional exposure. So you have somebody that's had exposure to whatever has gone on in his or her home, and then they come in and they're living in a community with kids that have had their own exposures. And so sometimes, particularly when kids are new, they come in, they're kind of explosive, they are aggressive, and other kids are exposed to that. In our particular school, because we have day students coming in, we have had, kids sometimes bringing in electronic devices or contraband into the school, so that's something that we've had to watch out for. So I think that there are times that it can be re-traumatizing for kids that have grown up with domestic violence, and they come to a program and they're in a program and then somebody starts yelling because they're in crisis themselves. That can bring up all of the feelings of the child who had been through domestic violence in his or her own family. We're in a great setting. It's very beautiful. Our particular program, we're in the middle of a state forest, which is wonderful, but we're not on public transportation. It can be hard for families to get to us, and I would say that this is the case for many, many programs. Most of the residential programs, as I'm sure that you're aware, are a distance. There aren't any programs in Boston itself, and so this is a challenge for families. Staffing inconsistencies, there's a lot of turnover with staffing. I'm just going to be frank about that. It's very hard work to be on the floor, to be floor staff with the kids for 8 hours a day. I mean, you've got kids that don't know how to get along with other people, that are aggressive, that are angry, and they take it out on the staff for 8 hours, and then you've got them you've got multiple kids doing that at the same time, and it can be a really stressful job. So it is not for the faint of heart. I think that the field understands that it's about that sort of the average life of a direct care floor staff is about 8 months, which isn't a very long time. Some stay longer. We encourage some to then go on to grad school to get their degrees in special education or to get their degrees in clinical treatment. And there can be staffing inconsistency from one end of the week to the other end of the week, or from one shift to another shift. I mean, if you think about your own homes and families, whatever went on with your child the night before, you understand that, and you're dealing with it on this particular day. The way that residential staff is set up is that there's one half of the week you've got one set of staff, and the other half of the week you've got another set of staff. So what happened on a Wednesday, the staff that's coming in on a Thursday, unless they have stayed in contact with the program and read their emails or touched base with their with supervisors, they may not know what's gone on the day before with the child. And so there can be some inconsistencies around those things. The way that we try and work it is, I think every program, it's a challenge in all residential programs. The way our particular program tries to do it is that we've got a supervisor in the cabin on both ends of the week, and those supervisors are responsible to each other and for keeping consistency in the cabin. Availability of resources is also a challenge. Residential, the funding for residential pays for the staff and the work with the children. It does not pay for extras, and so the home has been generous to us through its fundraising, but I think it's a challenge. We have kids that we've signed up for Pop Warner, and we've had to buy all of the sports equipment that goes with that and pay the Fee for Pop Warner. We've got kids in gymnastics. We've got one that's, she's actually, I think it's Saturday, she's got her recital for her hip-hop dance class. We've had voice lessons and violin lessons, and so all of these things are extra charges for the children, and DCF isn't always able to fund those as well. And so I think that's a challenge. We want to get the kids out in the community around other people as much as possible, but you know, there's a scarcity of resources, and that's one of the things that can help. We've had some educational surrogate parents in the past and have had connections with different soccer leagues, and so got one of the girls in a scholarship on a summer soccer camp, and she actually did really well and got put on a traveling soccer team. So there are, you know, different ways that I think that educational surrogate parents can be really helpful. For successful outcomes, you know, it's important that teamwork be really tight, that the clinical team, the educational team, and the floor staff all be on the same page in terms of, like, these are what the treatment goals are, this is how we're going to approach the situation, and that the family and other providers are involved as well. That's really important. Having splitting on the team does not help anyone. Rituals and routines are important. We have somebody that's actually graduating in another 2 weeks, and so it's a big deal. We make a big deal when the kids are graduating. We do a celebration with that. We've got some kids that at the end of the summer, they're still in school, but they will be moving on. They'll be moving back home, so we do celebrations for them as well. We want to mark these transitional times for them. Being creative, having, you know, creative solutions to problems. I just got a text on the way up here from one of our floor staff that was saying, you know, I think we can get this girl to buckle down and be more successful in school if we set up a volunteer for her at to work with cats at the local cat rescue place, because she's really into cats, and I think that this will be something that will get her more involved. Being very solution focused about the goals, being very, like, always holding out whatever the goals are. We've had somebody that came to us in full residential program, and we were able to step him down to a collaborative, and he still lived with us, and now, like, it's very exciting. I mean, it's taken a while, but now he, in the fall, he'll be starting public school, and it's very exciting for him, and it's exciting for the staff as well. And giving these guys a sense of mastery. Our particular program, we are known for taking kids that don't do well elsewhere, and so they, giving them a sense, you know, after many school failures and many placement failures, we want them to do well. And so we, you know, having a sense that, like, oh, I'm good at fishing, like, I am good at, wow, I'm actually really good at woodwork. Those kinds of things are really important for them. And I think, is it time for questions?
Yes, yes. Maureen, thank you so much. That was very illuminating, and some of the things, I actually learned some things myself. The integration in the community is something that I always wondered about, but it sounds like you constantly are trying to get them to be more integrated little step by little step until they're able to actually be successful. One of my questions, and please, if you have questions now in the audience, is the time to type them in. Most of the comments that have come in have been very nice. One woman said that she had seen some kids from the program selling birdhouses at a farmer's market.
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah.
And that they were so proud of themselves. So that's pretty cool. Probably made at woodworking, right?
It was made at woodworking, and actually it was part of the vocational program, which I didn't talk about. But yes, they learned how to then set up, how to market, and how to count change and all of that.
Mm-hmm. So the vocation, that was another thing I didn't realize. So you have kind of a vocational track. What ages are the kids at your program?
So in our particular program, we have the elementary school that starts at the age of 8, and then we go all the way through high school. So they are separated. We've got a elementary school, an intermediate school, and then a high school. Okay. And so the vocational classes are only for the high school, but the kids in the elementary school can participate in equine science and woodshop. They do some culinary. The elementary kids put on a catered a little event for one of the interns.
Oh, that's very awesome. Yeah. Now, do you have partnerships in the community where the kids might be able to get jobs while they're at your program? So in other words, they will go off campus to have a volunteer. It sounded like somebody was going to the cats, but to have actually paid jobs in the community. Does that ever happen?
So yes, so we actually have with an understanding with Walmart, our kids go through a sort of a training program with them, and then they have a 3-month placement with Walmart, and if Walmart feels that they're strong employees, then they get hired on, and that actually in some ways works well for them. We have somebody that's been working for Walmart now. She is going home at the end of the school year, and she can transition to another Walmart in her local community.
That's great. That's wonderful. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions. Someone is asking whether you train your staff in the actual pieces of developmental trauma.
So we do actually. The home has just developed a new trauma-informed care training. The staff are also trained in cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, so that's like different things to do to work on when kids are traumatized. And then the clinical team in every staff meeting each month presents a different aspect of developmental trauma and working with developmental trauma. Last month, I believe I did one on, it was on the biology and physiology of psychological trauma. The month before that, we worked on self-care and vicarious trauma and the impact on staff of understanding what the kids have been through.
That's wonderful. And I know one of the things that the Trauma Center created, I don't know if that's the right word, is the ARC therapy. And one of our members of the audience is asking if you use that at
Yes, that was actually something that I brought to the Southeast campus when I came 7 years ago. So I brought the ARC model. The home has also developed a relationship with John Briere and Cheryl Langtree out at UCLA, and they use the ITCT model, which is the integrated treatment of complex trauma, which works very well with the ARC model. And so those are both evidence-based practices, as is the trauma-focused CBT, which we also use.
Yes, okay. That's wonderful. So you're very, very trauma-informed over there.
Yes.
One of our listeners, who I think must be an advocate, a parent advocate, is wondering how to get kids in a place like this, in a residential placement. Now, most of the kids that are in your program are coming through DCF, is that true?
We have some that are coming from school systems as well. So it sort of depends. Basically, because kids need to be in the least restrictive environment, these are kids that have done poorly in public school and then have done poorly in a collaborative. In our particular program, one of the things that we do a lot of treatment with is trauma-reactive sexual behaviors. So sometimes kids will come directly from public school if there's been some kind of trauma-reactive sexual behavior that's occurred at school.
Another question is asking whether if you ever use ABA, and that's always a controversial subject for kids with trauma. And I think maybe what she's asking is, do you have kids there on the spectrum who might benefit from ABA?
We do.
And have also have been traumatized.
We do have kids on the spectrum that have experienced trauma, and that is, those kids tend to be with us actually for longer because they learn in different ways and because the trauma impacts them much more severely. And so we don't use ABA specifically, but we have very individualized behavior support plans and are very clear with the kids that are on the spectrum. I think the things that work for kids that are traumatized and that work for kids on the spectrum, like consistency, predictability, structure and routine, they work for kids that have been traumatized and kids on the spectrum.
Yes. Okay, great. So somebody is asking, I'm assuming that she's a teacher perhaps or an administrator in a public school, and she said she wants to know where you think is the best place for employees of public schools to receive trauma-informed care training.
I think that can be I think that can be a challenge. I know that our particular school staff did trauma-informed care training at the Plymouth Public Schools. I know that I, 5 or 6 years ago, went to a trauma-informed care training at MAPS. I think that there are a number of different places. I would say that anything that is through, I would recommend anything through the trauma center, and I think the home also has a training department and would be willing to train people as well.
Yes, and just a plug for the Federation that I myself do trauma and learning trainings, not to a great extent, but we are available on a limited basis, I'm going to say, if people are interested in that. The other interesting question is, let me just scroll, oh boy, they're coming in fast and furious now, Maureen. Transitioning home. Someone had an interesting question about the home visits and how do you prepare kids to successfully return to the home, and do you work with the families to bring them back, I guess make the families trauma informed?
Yes, so those behavior support plans that we talked about, those are given to the families, and we do, DCF has this great thing now called Follow Along, which is that it starts, so in terms of the children that we've had transition home, and we've had a bunch, and so what happens is that there's family therapy that's taking place both on campus and in the home while the child is still with us, and then as the child transitions home, they have their advocate that's from the floor staff who sort of serves as a therapeutic mentor, and then the clinician continues to do work in the home with the family. And this is while they're getting connected with services in the community, so it's a way to kind of bridge services in the community and the residential programming.
I had not heard of that. I have to look into that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of questions, actually several, about autism and trauma. And I know that a lot of the early symptomology of trauma can look a lot like kids on the spectrum. When I do trainings, a lot of people will say, where does it veer off? And I think that's probably another webinar.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But it all has to do with the developmental stages of kids and their level of cognition and stuff like that. So we might take a look at that in a future webinar. There's also an issue with ADHD and trauma, mm-hmm. and distinguishing between the two. A lot of people are saying, I think that they've been impressed with your program and would love to know how to get their kids there, and you know, the funding, the cost sharing between mm-hmm. DCF, DMH, public schools, etc. And I know when people call us, it's always, do I have to give my kids up into the custody of the state, etc., etc. Again, I think those are questions that continue to be asked, and I don't know if we have a clear formula. As far as I know, we do not.
No, I think it's very different, and I think as your folks are aware that different towns are different. Yes. We have some towns that send kids to full res ed with us, and then we have other towns that balk at doing a cost share with DCF, mm-hmm. and so I think it really depends. And I think that the educational surrogate parents have a really tough job mm-hmm. trying to advocate and trying to bring a plan together. But I guess I would say is that you keep pushing for what what is in the child's best interest, and moving them up a level of care if they're struggling with where they are, if the current school can't meet their needs.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Okay. We have not answered all the questions that have come in, so between me and you, Maureen, maybe we can contact them by email.
Okay.
And thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and we will see you again next month. And thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you.